Story 1. Gather round, and let the gentle patter of the rain against the window pane lull you into a quiet contemplation. Tonight, I want to share a story, not one of fantastical beasts or daring heroes, but something far more intriguing, a quiet mystery that nestled itself into my life like a forgotten bookmark in an old novel. It's a tale spun from threads of faded ink and hushed whispers, a secret held close by a sleepy little town named Oakhaven. I found Oakhaven quite by accident, or perhaps it found me. After years spent sifting through the clamor of city archives, chasing the loud, grand narratives of history, I craved the quiet. A sabbatical led me to this forgotten corner of the world, a place where the mountains embraced the sea, and time seemed to stretch, thick and slow, like molasses. My intention was simply to write, to let the silence clear my mind. I rented a small cottage, nestled at the edge of a whispering forest, where the only regular visitors were the deer and the persistent, calming drizzle. The cottage itself felt ancient, its wooden beams groaning companionably with the wind, and the air always carried the faint, sweet scent of damp earth and old timber. Most evenings, I'd sit by the fireplace, a mug of chamomile tea warming my hands, listening to the rain's soft rhythm. It was during one such evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, that my gaze fell upon a small, dusty box tucked away on a forgotten shelf in the built-in library. It wasn't much, just a plain wooden box, but it had a certain heft to it, a weight that hinted at more than just forgotten trinkets. Inside, beneath a layer of brittle lace, I found a collection of old photographs, their edges softened by time, and a handful of yellowed newspaper clippings. The photographs depicted stern-faced men and women in stiff collars and long skirts, their eyes holding a faraway gaze. The clippings, however, were what truly caught my attention. They were from the Oakhaven Gazette, a local paper long out of print, and they spoke of a time when the town was a bustling hub of the logging industry. But one series of articles, tucked away at the bottom, felt different. They were short, almost hesitant, and they revolved around a single, perplexing event: the disappearance of Elara Vance. Elara. The name itself felt like a sigh in the quiet room. The articles were sparse, factual, and deeply unsatisfying. Elara Vance, a young woman described as spirited and uncommonly kind, vanished on a cool autumn evening in the year 1932. She had simply walked away from her family home, ostensibly for an evening stroll, and was never seen again. No trace, no struggle, just a profound absence. The initial reports were hopeful, then increasingly grim. The search parties, the interviews with neighbors, the desperate pleas for information, it all faded into a polite, regretful silence in the subsequent week's papers. The case was eventually closed, filed away as a presumed runaway, or a tragic accident in the vast, unforgiving wilderness surrounding Oakhaven. But the tone of those clippings, even in their terse formality, held a peculiar echo. A feeling of something left unsaid, a question lingering in the printed words like the scent of wood smoke on a winter coat. My historian's instinct, dulled by urban distractions, began to prickle. This wasn't just a forgotten local story. It felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, scattered to the wind. My calm sabbatical had found its purpose. The next morning, a soft mist clung to the forest, blurring the edges of the world, as I made my way to the Oakhaven Public Library. It was a modest building, smelling wonderfully of old paper and beeswax, and presided over by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations. She looked at me with a knowing smile when I asked about the Oakhaven Gazette archives, as if she'd been expecting someone like me to eventually come calling. "Elara Vance," she murmured, a gentle sigh escaping her lips. "A sad story, dear. A very sad story." The archives were a treasure trove of forgotten ephemera. Town council minutes, church bulletins, local advertisements for remedies and farm equipment. I spent my days poring over them, the soft rustle of aged paper becoming a soothing companion. The library's big window looked out onto the town's only street, where the occasional car ambled by, or a stray dog chased a particularly interesting scent. The rhythm of Oakhaven was a balm, allowing my mind to unfurl and connect the dots. I noticed subtle shifts in the Gazette's language as the weeks following Elara's disappearance stretched into months. Initially, there was a sense of shared community concern, then a quiet resignation. But I also found subtle hints of whispers around the story. A brief mention of a misunderstanding at the local mill where Elara's father worked, a sudden increase in patrols by the small-town sheriff, a peculiar letter to the editor bemoaning the lack of vigilance in the community, quickly dismissed by the editor as unfounded speculation. These were the faint echoes of something more complex than a simple vanishing. I learned that Alara lived with her parents and 2 younger siblings in a small house near the river. Her father, Thomas Vance, was a quiet man, known for his meticulous work at the mill. Her mother, Martha, was a seamstress, highly regarded for her delicate stitches. Alara herself was described as bright, with a love for books and a gentle way with children. She had no known enemies, no grand ambitions to leave Oakhaven, at least according to the official accounts. My research led me to the mill, now a skeletal ruin of its former self, overgrown with ivy and wild roses. The air here was heavy with the ghost of sawdust and industry. I walked the paths Alara might have walked, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot mirroring the rustle of old papers in my hands. The river, still flowing, seemed to hold its own secrets, its surface mirroring the endless gray sky. One afternoon, I found a small, handwritten diary amidst a box of miscellaneous town records Mrs. Gable had unearthed from a back room. It belonged to a woman named Beatrice Dubois, a contemporary of Alara's and a close friend. Beatrice's entries, written in a delicate, looping script, offered a glimpse into the everyday life of Oakhaven, the small joys and minor sorrows. But then, there were the entries concerning Alara. Beatrice spoke of Alara's unusual restlessness in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Alara seems troubled, one entry read. She speaks of secrets, of things hidden just beneath the surface of Oakhaven's calm. Another, she believes she has found something important, something that could change everything. There was no mention of what this something was, only a growing sense of unease in Beatrice's words. The last entry referring to Alara was short, frantic. Alara is gone. Oh dear God, she is gone. And I fear it is because of what she knew. This was the first true crack in the placid surface of the official narrative. Alara hadn't just vanished. She had been on the cusp of a discovery. But what? And what was the secret she had found? I returned to the Gazette clippings, rereading every word, searching for anything I might have missed. I paid closer attention to the advertisements, the small notices, the local gossip columns, and then a tiny detail emerged, almost too insignificant to notice. A series of property sales around the same time, all involving parcels of land near the old, abandoned. Mine on the outskirts of town. Nothing unusual, except that the owners were listed as various shell companies, quickly dissolved after the transactions. And one of the initial sellers, a reclusive old man who lived near the mine, had suddenly and quietly left Oakhaven shortly after Alara's disappearance. The mine. Oakhaven had been founded on mining before the logging boom. The old Blackwood mine had been depleted decades ago, deemed worthless. But what if it wasn't? What if Alara, in her spirited curiosity, had stumbled upon something there? Perhaps not gold or silver, but something else, something the town, or certain individuals within it, preferred to keep hidden. The air in my cottage grew cooler as evening fell. The rain continued its steady tattoo on the roof, a comforting sound, yet one that seemed to underscore the unanswered questions. I thought of Alara, a young woman with a curious mind, walking into the twilight, perhaps drawn by a glimmer of truth. Did she go to the mine? Did she see something there she shouldn't have? The lack of any trace, any sign of a struggle, pointed to a meticulously clean disappearance. Someone had been very careful. I imagined the quiet desperation of her parents, the town's collective sigh of relief when the case was closed, the quiet agreement to let the unsettling truth sleep. Because sometimes in small towns, the greatest secrets are kept not by conspiracy, but by a shared, unspoken understanding that some things are better left undisturbed, lest they disrupt the fragile peace. I never found the definitive answer. No smoking gun, no last, desperate diary entry. The records of the shell companies were untraceable, the old man who sold the land long deceased, his family having moved away generations ago. Oakhaven held its secrets close, wrapped in the mists and the gentle rain. But the story of Alara Vance, the spirited girl who sought a hidden truth, stayed with me. It became a quiet companion in the stillness of my cottage. When the wind howled through the trees, I'd imagine it carrying her whisper. When the morning sun touched the old wooden beams, I'd see the light reflecting off the pages of Beatrice's diary. And sometimes, when the rain falls just so, and the lamp casts its soft, yellow glow across my desk, I can almost feel her presence, a gentle inquiry in the air. What did she know, Alara? What truth did you uncover in the quiet corners of Oakhaven? A truth so profound it simply dissolved you into the very fabric of the landscape. The town, with its ancient forests and murmuring river, holds its breath, and the answer remains, for now, a secret whispered only to the wind. Story 2. Let me share a story with you tonight, one that lingers in the quieter corners of my mind, like the scent of damp earth after a long rain. It's not a tale spun from imagination, but rather one I pieced together, fragment by quiet fragment, during my years tucked away in the sleepy town of Oakhaven. Pull your blanket a little closer, and listen to the soft tap-tap of the night outside. It sets the perfect rhythm for a mystery that remains, to this day, a whisper carried on the wind. I moved to Oakhaven some years ago, seeking nothing more than the profound quiet it offered. My life as an archivist in the city had been one of constant clatter and hurried deadlines. Here, nestled deep in a valley where the mist often clung to the ancient oak trees like forgotten lace, the loudest sound was often the methodical tick of my grandfather clock or the distant cry of a lone owl. My small cottage, a sturdy stone structure with a perpetually damp scent of old wood, became my sanctuary. It was within its quiet walls, surrounded by my inherited collection of dusty tomes and local histories, that the story of Elias Thorne first began to unfurl for me. Elias Thorne. The name appeared, almost accidentally, in a brittle old ledger I'd acquired at a local estate sale. It was a mundane record, mostly detailing property transfers and minor grievances from the early 1900s, but one entry, dated autumn of 1908, caught my eye. Elias Thorne, abatement of taxes, property abandoned. Abandoned. In Oakhaven, where families clung to their land like barnacles to a ship, abandonment was rare, almost unheard of. It suggested something abrupt, something unresolved. My archivist's curiosity, dormant for years, stirred. The night I first encountered Elias's name in earnest, a gentle rain was tracing silver patterns down my window panes. The soft glow of my desk lamp, a faithful companion with its chipped ceramic base, cast long, wavering shadows across the pages of the ledger. I remember the smell of the old paper, dry and faintly sweet, a scent that always promised forgotten lives. Who was Elias Thorne, and why had his property been abandoned? The ledger offered no answers, merely a quiet declaration of absence. My initial investigations were modest. I began with the Oakhaven Public Records, a small, unassuming office housed in the old schoolhouse, presided over by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose memory seemed to stretch back further than any document. She was a repository of local lore, wrapped in a perpetually cheerful demeanor. Elias Thorne, she mused, her brow furrowing slightly as she tapped a chipped teacup. Oh dear, that's a name I haven't heard whispered in quite some time. A peculiar sort, they said, kept to himself, loved his plants. Her words were delivered with a sigh, a soft, almost imperceptible tremor in her voice that suggested a deeper, unarticulated history. I delved deeper, sifting through census records, dusty newspaper clippings from the Oakhaven Gazette, a publication that had ceased printing decades ago, and even old church registers. Elias Thorne, I learned, had arrived in Oakhaven in the late 1890s, a transplant from some distant city, drawn, it seemed, by the unique biodiversity of the ancient blackwood forest that cradled the town. He was a botanist, albeit an amateur one, with a singular passion for mosses, ferns, and the more esoteric flora of the region. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, almost reclusive, often seen venturing into the woods with a worn canvas satchel and a magnifying glass. He lived alone, in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, closer to the forest than to any other dwelling. The newspaper archives yielded a single, tantalizing clue. A brief, almost dismissive article from October 1908, buried deep within the local news section. Local man missing. It spoke of Mr. Elias Thorne, not seen for several days. Neighbors, concerned by the unlit lamps in his cabin and the untouched firewood by his door, had alerted the constable. A brief search of his property and the immediate surrounding woods had yielded nothing. The article concluded with a rather perfunctory note about the constable hoping for his safe return. No urgency, no alarm. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a missing person. It was as if Oakhaven, even then, understood the porous nature of existence at the edge of the deep woods. This was the nature of the mystery, not a sudden violent act, but an evaporation. Elias Thorne simply ceased to be present. He didn't leave a note, didn't pack his belongings, didn't sell his property. He just vanished. The contrast between the abruptness of his disappearance and the understated reactions of the records was unsettling. It felt as though Oakhaven had absorbed his absence with a quiet shrug, as if such things were simply part of the fabric of its existence. My research led me to the Oakhaven Historical Society, a slightly less dusty, though equally quiet, repository of the town's past. Here, among faded photographs and the scent of beeswax polish, I found a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't Elias's, but it belonged to a contemporary, an elderly woman named Clara Finch, who had been a local schoolteacher with a keen eye for detail. Her entries were meticulous, describing daily life, local gossip, and the changing seasons. And then a series of entries in late 1908, referring to Elias. October 10th, Mr. Thorne was speaking again of his luminous moss. Said he was close to a breakthrough. I confess, I find his obsessions peculiar, but his enthusiasm is, in its own way, charming. He intends to venture deeper into the Blackwood tomorrow, to a part he calls the Whispering Glade. He believes the conditions there are perfect for its cultivation. October 14th, still no sign of Mr. Thorne. A few of the men went to his cabin. It seemed undisturbed, save for a half-packed satchel on his table, as if he intended to return promptly. The entire town feels a quiet unease. It is not like him to simply disappear without a word, even with his solitary habits. October 20th, the search for Mr. Thorne has been called off. Constable Davies believes he may have simply wandered off, perhaps to another town, or lost his way in the deeper woods. But I saw him just days before he vanished. He spoke of the moss with such excitement, like a child with a secret. I cannot believe he would simply abandon his life's work, not when he was so close to his elusive light-bringer. Clara Finch's entries brought Elias Thorne to life for me, transforming him from a name in a ledger to a man consumed by a passionate, if slightly eccentric, pursuit. Luminous moss. The phrase conjured images of delicate, glowing greenery, hidden deep within the shadowy embrace of the Blackwood. It added a layer of almost mythical beauty to his disappearance. Had he found it? And if so, what then? I spent days poring over old maps, trying to locate the Whispering Glade. It wasn't marked, of course, but Clara's descriptions, combined with what little I could glean from Elias's own cryptic notes, a few pages of which were tucked into the journal, Clara having apparently saved them, suggested a secluded, almost otherworldly pocket of the forest, perhaps near a hidden spring or a particularly ancient grove of trees. The woods themselves seemed to hold their breath as I studied the maps, the silence of my cottage broken only by the scratching of my pen against paper as I transcribed Clara's words. The more I learned, the more the mystery deepened. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an accident. Elias's cabin was found tidy, his botanist's tools neatly arranged. His half-packed satchel, as Clara noted, suggested a planned, though perhaps hurried, return. It was as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and then, instead of returning, had stepped into another realm entirely. Local whispers, as Mrs. Gable gently offered, hinted at darker possibilities. Some said the Blackwood Forest had its own will, that it claimed those who ventured too deep, especially those who sought its hidden treasures. Others spoke of the old ones, spirits of the earth, who resented intrusion. These were not theories offered with malice, but rather with a resigned understanding. A folk wisdom born of centuries lived in close proximity to untamed wilderness. It was the way Oakhaven explained the inexplicable, by attributing it to the ancient, powerful forces that govern the land. One afternoon, during a particularly heavy downpour that drummed a soothing rhythm on my roof, I decided to visit what remained of Elias Thorne's cabin. It was little more than crumbling stone and rotting wood, swallowed almost entirely by the encroaching forest. The path was overgrown, winding through a tangle of ferns and damp undergrowth. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the constant drip, drip, drip from the canopy above. Standing amidst the ruins, I felt a profound sense of Elias's presence, not as a ghost, but as an echo. The silence here was different from the silence of my cottage. It was a watchful, patient silence, as if the forest itself held the final answer. I ran my hand over a moss-covered stone, part of what would have been his hearth. It felt cool and alive, a testament to the persistent embrace of nature. It struck me that Elias, with his love for plants, might have found a strange peace in becoming one with the very forest he adored. I tried, gently, to imagine his last moments. Did he walk into the woods with a sense of triumphant discovery, holding a sample of his glowing moss? Did he simply sit down, perhaps overwhelmed by the beauty or the isolation, and choose not to return? The lack of drama, the sheer quietude of his vanishing, was what made it so haunting. It defied all expectations of a typical missing person case, leaving behind only a void and a few tantalizing hints. The only physical trace I ever found of Elias Thorne, beyond the records, was a small, smooth river stone, tucked away in the hollow of a rotted tree stump near his cabin. It wasn't remarkable in itself, but engraved on its surface, almost imperceptibly, was a single stylized leaf. It was a detail so subtle, so easily overlooked, that it felt like a deliberate, quiet farewell. I kept the stone on my desk, a silent companion to my thoughts, a tactile link to a man I only knew through whispers and faded ink. As I closed the chapter on Elias Thorne in my mind each night, the quiet questions remain. Did he find his luminous moss, and did it lead him somewhere beyond our ken? Was his disappearance a peaceful absorption into the natural world he so admired, or a sudden, inexplicable departure from it? Oakhaven, with its ancient trees and its deep, still waters, holds its secrets close. The rain still falls, the mist still rises, and the blackwood forest still whispers. And in those whispers, I sometimes imagine, I hear the faint echo of Elias Thorne, forever entwined with the mysteries of the deep, green earth. And that, perhaps, is all the solution we are meant to find. And I hope you found this story intriguing, and that it provided a quiet moment of reflection. I tried to weave a narrative that felt authentic and unresolved, focusing on the atmospheric details and the slow uncovering of a forgotten past. The story highlights the quiet mystery of Elias Thorne's disappearance, leaning into the idea that not all vanishing acts have a neat explanation. The calm tone and subtle sensory details aim to create that bedtime story feel, leaving you with a sense of lingering curiosity rather than unease. Story 3. Let me tell you a story, not of grand adventures or soaring triumphs, but of quiet discoveries, of echoes found in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, and of a mystery that still breathes softly in the salt-tinged air of an old New England town. My name is Arthur, and I've spent the better part of my retired years nestled here in Oakhaven, a place where the gulls cry like distant memories and the houses lean into the ocean breeze as if whispering secrets to one another. I was once a historian, you see, a keeper of facts and figures, but here, in the gentle rhythm of the tides, I've become more of an attentive listener to the past. My small cottage, perched on a slight rise overlooking the bay, is my sanctuary. On nights when the rain taps a soft rhythm against the window panes, and the old house sighs with the settling of its timbers, I often find myself in my study. It's a room filled with the scent of aged paper and warm tea, bathed in the comforting glow of a single desk lamp. It was on just such a night, some months ago now, that my path crossed with Alara Vance. Not directly, of course. Alara, if the old records are to be believed, vanished from Oakhaven Bay almost 90 years ago. My current project, a self-imposed task I find rather soothing, involves digitizing the town's archived records. Births, deaths, property deeds, old newspaper clippings, a tapestry of lives lived and forgotten. The Historical Society, bless their hearts, had piles of these brittle documents, yellowed and fragile, their ink often faded to a ghostly whisper. Handling them, feeling the thin, almost transparent paper, is like holding a piece of time itself. Each sheet hums with stories. It was during one particularly blustery Tuesday, with the wind rattling my windows like an impatient guest, that I came across a small, almost insignificant entry in the town ledger from 1937. It wasn't the main focus of the page, which dealt with property taxes and some trivial local ordinance about chickens. No, it was a handwritten note in the margin, almost an afterthought, penned in a surprisingly elegant script that stood out from the usual hurried scrawl of the town clerk. Vance E. Missing, per Sheriff's Report, October 14th. Alara Vance. The name snagged in my mind like a burr on a wool blanket. Most disappearances in small towns like Oakhaven, especially back then, were noted more formally, with follow-up reports. This marginalia felt dismissive, as if her absence was less a concern and more an inconvenience. My historian's curiosity, dormant for years, began to stir like a drowsy cat. I brewed another pot of jasmine tea, its floral steam coiling gently around my face, and pulled the box labeled Sheriff's Reports, 1930 to 1940. The reports were a mixed bag: petty thefts, a few drunken brawls, the occasional lost fishing boat. It took a while to find Sheriff Brody's report from October 14, 1937. The paper was stiff, the typewriter ink a faint gray. The report was brief, almost shockingly so. Alara Vance, a new resident who had rented the old lighthouse keeper's cottage on the isolated western point of the bay, had not been seen for several days. Her landlord had reported her absence after not receiving her monthly rent. The sheriff had conducted a cursory search of the cottage and the immediate area. No signs of struggle. No note. The conclusion: presumed left town abruptly. Presumed left town abruptly. The phrase echoed in the quiet of my study, feeling hollow. A young woman, living alone in a somewhat remote spot, simply packs up and vanishes without a word, leaving her belongings? It struck me as rather neat, too neat for the untidiness of real life. The subtle unease began to creep in, not as a chill, but as a persistent question, a note held a little too long in a quiet melody. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn deeper into Alara Vance's story, or rather, the lack thereof. The local newspaper archives were my next port of call. The Oak Haven Chronicle, a thin weekly paper, was a treasure trove of mundane detail, but Alara's disappearance received scant attention. A small notice, buried on page 3, beneath an announcement about the annual clam bake, local woman missing. No follow-up articles, no public appeals, no speculation. It was as if the town collectively shrugged and moved on. I learned a few things, piecing together fragments. Alara had arrived in Oak Haven in the spring of 1937, alone. She was described by a few cautious mentions in social columns as an artist from New York City, seeking solitude and inspiration. This detail was important. Oak Haven was a fishing town, insular and set in its ways. A solitary artist from the bustling city would have been an anomaly, perhaps even viewed with suspicion. She wasn't of Oak Haven. This likely explained the muted response to her vanishing. She was an outsider, and outsiders sometimes simply drifted away. I visited the lighthouse keeper's cottage, or what remained of it. Time and harsh coastal weather had not been kind. It stood now as a skeletal ruin, battered by storms, its windows long gone, its roof caved in. Yet, as I stood there, the ceaseless whisper of the wind through the broken timbers felt like a mournful sigh. I tried to imagine Alara, a vibrant young woman, living within those walls, painting, perhaps, or writing, her gaze fixed on the same boundless ocean that stretched before me. The air itself felt heavy with unanswered questions. My research continued, meticulous and slow, a comforting routine. I examined property records again. Alara had paid her rent for 6 months, always in cash. There was no forwarding address, no correspondence. It was a blank slate. Yet, a tiny detail emerged from a dusty ledger I almost overlooked, a faint pencil notation next to the rent entry for September. Repairs requested. Leak in study. It was a small thing, but it suggested a level of care for the property, an expectation of continued residency. Someone planning to leave abruptly wouldn't bother with a leak in the study. Then came the meeting with Mrs. Gable, a spry 90-year-old with eyes like polished sea glass, who still lived in the same clapboard house her family had occupied for generations. I encountered her at the weekly town market, where she sold homemade preserves. I'd offered to carry her basket of jars, and we struck up a conversation. When I delicately brought up the name Alara Vance, her clear eyes seemed to cloud for a moment, as if a distant shadow had passed over them. Alara Vance, she mused, her voice thin but steady, like the rustle of dry leaves. Oh yes, the artist, always sketching the rocks. Different she was, not like us. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the horizon. There were whispers, after she left. Nothing solid, mind you. Just talk. About the fishing boats, and the storms that year. She wouldn't elaborate, her lips pressing into a thin line, but the implication hung in the air, a faint, unsettling perfume. The whispers, the storms, a natural disaster, perhaps, had claimed her. But if so, why no body? Why no debris? The ocean rarely gives up its secrets, but it usually offers a trace. The thought kept me awake on occasion, the tapping of rain on the roof amplifying the silence, my mind tracing the faint lines of Alara's story. The idea of a quiet, unassuming town like Oak Haven harboring a darker truth was not sensational. It was simply intriguing. Not a tale of grand evil, but perhaps one of small-town secrets, of judgment, of an outsider swallowed not by the sea, but by the indifference of a community. My most poignant discovery came from a collection of private letters donated to the Historical Society just last year, from the estate of a reclusive old woman named Martha Finley. Martha had been a seamstress and apparently a keen observer of human nature, who kept detailed correspondence with her sister in Boston. One letter, dated early November 1937, caught my eye. Dearest Agnes, it began, the ink a faded sepia. Oak Haven is quieter than usual. That artist woman, Miss Vance, has gone. They say she just packed up, but I saw her last piece of work, unfinished, on an easel in her cottage window, only 2 days before she was said to have left. a painting of the old fishing docks, half done. And her cat, a ginger tabby, was found by the postman near the general store, thin and crying for days. Miss Vance loved that cat. Doesn't seem like the sort to leave a beloved pet behind, does it? My heart aches for the poor creature. There's more to this, Agnes, than they're saying. I feel it in my bones, like a coming storm. A chill, not from the autumn air, but from the words themselves, settled over me. An unfinished painting, a beloved cat abandoned. These were not the actions of someone who presumed left town abruptly. These were the loose threads of a narrative that did not quite fit. Martha Finley, the quiet seamstress, had seen it too. She had intuited the dissonance. I never found the painting. I never found another mention of the cat after Martha's letter. I never found a single witness who saw Alara Vance leave Oakhaven. Every path I traced led to a dead end, a quiet omission, a collective forgetting. The records simply faded, the newspaper moved on, and the whispers of Mrs. Gable remained just that, whispers. And so, here in my study, with the fire crackling softly in the hearth and the moon casting long shadows across the bay, I often think of Alara Vance. She remains a phantom, a wisp of a story in the annals of Oakhaven's past. Her disappearance, so neatly filed away, so casually dismissed, feels now like a wound that never truly healed, a note deliberately left out of a familiar tune. I haven't solved it, not in the way a detective would, with a clear culprit and a final, satisfying explanation. But perhaps, in a quiet, historical sense, I have unearthed something just as important. I've rescued Alara Vance from the dusty corners of forgetfulness. I've brought her story, however incomplete, back into the gentle lamplight. And sometimes, when the wind howls a particularly mournful tune around the eaves of my old cottage, I imagine it carrying Alara's unfinished melody, a quiet question sighing through the salt marshes, over the darkened waters of Oakhaven Bay. It is a mystery that lingers, a testament to the fact that even in the most serene of places, history can hold its breath, waiting for someone to listen for the whispers of what might have been. And perhaps that is the true story, the one that remains just beyond our grasp, a quiet, unsolved puzzle beneath the comforting blanket of night. Story 4. In a quiet corner of my world, where the days unfurl like ancient maps and the air always carries the scent of salt and pine, I found myself drawn into a story. Not one of grand adventures or soaring triumphs, but a gentle, persistent whisper from the past, a true crime tale that never quite found its final chapter. It began, as many such stories do, with an old house and a promise of stillness. I am Evelyn, a historical researcher by trade, accustomed to sifting through the dust of forgotten archives and coaxing secrets from faded ink. My sabbatical had led me to Oakhaven, a village nestled on the rugged Maine coast, a place where time seemed to drowse beneath a perpetual mist. I'd leased a small cottage, its weathered shingles smelling of damp earth and the sea, its windows looking out onto a world of stoic spruce trees and the restless, murmuring ocean. Each evening, as the light softened to a hazy gold and then faded to deep indigo, I would sit by the window, a cup of herbal tea warming my hands, listening to the rhythmic sigh of the waves and the gentle patter of rain on the roof, a sound as comforting as a lullaby. It was in the hushed quiet of the Oakhaven Historical Society, a grand old building that smelled faintly of beeswax and drying paper, that I first encountered the ghost of Alara Vance. My initial purpose had been to delve into local maritime legends, particularly those concerning unexplained disappearances at sea. The Society's archivist, a kind woman named Mrs. Finch, with eyes like clear sea glass, had patiently guided me through stacks of bound newspapers and brittle ledger books. One particularly damp afternoon, as the sky wept a soft, steady rain against the window panes, I pulled open a drawer marked Unresolved Incidents, 1950s to 1970s. Inside, nestled amidst faded photographs of shipwrecks and old town notices, was a slim, unassuming file. Its label read, Vance Alara. Disappeared, October 17, 1968. I remember the feeling distinctly, a gentle tug, a quiet insistence that this was a thread worth following. The folder was thin, almost an afterthought, suggesting that the town, in its long history of battling the unforgiving sea, had perhaps grown accustomed to things simply vanishing. But even in its brevity, there was a quiet ache to the contents. Alara Vance was, according to the few newspaper clippings, the 18-year-old daughter of the lighthouse keeper, Silas Vance. She lived a solitary life, primarily tending to her ailing mother, while her father kept vigil over the churning waters. The articles painted a picture of a quiet, artistic girl, fond of sketching the wild beauty of the coast, and often seen with her nose buried in a book. The official conclusion had been presumed drowned, or likely runaway. Common enough fates for those who lived so close to the indifferent ocean or dreamed of a life beyond Oakhaven's quiet embrace. Yet, something in the sparse details bothered me. The initial police report, a typewritten document with smudged carbon copies, noted that Alara had been last seen leaving her home at the lighthouse just before dusk. She told her mother she was going for a walk down to the tide pools, a favorite haunt of hers. Her mother, too frail to accompany her, hadn't thought much of it until the moon rose high and Alara still hadn't returned. Silas, returning from his shift, began a frantic search. The search itself was brief. A few local fishermen, Silas, and a couple of deputies scoured the shoreline for days. They found nothing but the relentless waves and the jagged rocks. No body, no trace, not even a scarf or a shoe. This detail hummed quietly in my mind. The ocean, while vast, often gave back what it took eventually. To leave absolutely no trace was unusual. What truly piqued my gentle curiosity, however, were the small, almost overlooked details within the file. One brief mention caught my eye. Alara's locket, a small silver heart with a faded forget-me-not etched into its surface, was found on her bed. It was described as a gift from her mother, rarely removed. Why leave it behind if she was merely going for a walk, or even planning to run away? It felt like a deliberate act, a quiet message left behind. I began to spend my days at the Historical Society, not merely as a researcher, but as a quiet listener to the echoes of Oakhaven. I requested Old Town Council meeting minutes, local church records, anything that might mention the Vance family or the period around Alara's disappearance. Mrs. Finch, sensing my deepening interest, would occasionally bring me a fresh cup of tea, its steam curling softly in the dim light of the archives, and share a snippet of local lore or a gentle memory of the Vance family. Silas Vance was a man of few words. She told me one afternoon, her voice soft as the rustle of old leaves. Kept to himself mostly. After Alara, well, he just withered. Moved away a few years later. No one heard from him again. I discovered that Alara's mother, weakened by illness and the profound grief of her daughter's vanishing, passed away within a year of Alara's disappearance. The lighthouse, once a beacon of their lives, had become a tomb of unanswered questions. As I delved deeper, I found an intriguing detail, almost an aside, in a local newspaper column from a few weeks after Alara vanished. It was a letter to the editor, and signed, lamenting the town's perceived quickness to dismiss Alara's case. The writer spoke of whispers, of strange lights, and of the old tale of the fading daughter of the cove. Mrs. Finch had mentioned local superstitions. The fading daughter was a legend about a young woman who, heartbroken, walked into a specific hidden cove during a rising tide and simply became one with the mist. A beautiful, tragic myth, perhaps, but its mention here felt unsettling. I sought out the cove. It wasn't on any tourist map, a secluded inlet known only to the oldest locals, accessible by a winding, overgrown path behind the lighthouse. One crisp autumn morning, with the sun casting long shadows through the ancient trees, I walked the path myself. The air was cool and still, broken only by the cry of gulls and the distant thrum of the ocean. The cove itself was a crescent of black, worn pebbles, fringed by dramatic, wave-sculpted cliffs. A thin mist clung to the rocks, even on a clear day, giving the place an ethereal, almost spectral quality. It felt old, and it felt like a place where things could indeed fade. Back in my cottage, as the evenings grew longer and the rain fell more frequently, I found myself piecing together the fragments. I discovered that Alara, despite her quiet nature, had a few confidants at the local library, a woman named Clara Davies, who had since moved away, and a boy named Thomas, who worked at the general store. Thomas was long gone, but I found Clara in an old Oakhaven yearbook. A quick search led me to an address a few states away. I wrote to Clara a long, rambling letter explaining my research, asking if she remembered anything about Alara Vance. Weeks later, a reply arrived, thin and fragile. Clara was an elderly woman now, her handwriting shaky but clear. She remembered Alara vividly. Alara was special, Clara wrote. Not like the other girls in Oakhaven. She saw things differently. She used to talk about the singing stones in the cove, said she could hear them hum during certain tides. And she spoke of a secret place, a doorway in the mist, where she felt most at peace. Clara also mentioned a detail not found in any official report. A few weeks before she disappeared, Alara seemed troubled. Distant. She kept a small journal, a handmade one, and she guarded it fiercely. She told me she was writing about something she'd seen, something that wasn't supposed to be there in the cove. She never said what. A journal. This was new, and the something that wasn't supposed to be there. My mind, usually so precise and analytical, began to wander into softer, more speculative realms. The official narrative of a runaway or accidental drowning seemed increasingly inadequate. I went back to the Historical Society. Mrs. Finch, upon hearing about the journal, remembered Silas Vance had donated a box of Alara's belongings to the society years ago, before he left. We never really cataloged it properly, she admitted, a gentle blush rising on her cheeks. Just old school books and trinkets, we assumed. Buried in a dusty corner of the archives, in a box filled with Alara's school essays and dried wildflowers, I found it. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages softened by time, its cover adorned with a crude, yet distinct, drawing of the lighthouse and the swirling mist of the cove. As I opened it, the faint scent of dried lavender and old paper filled the air. Alara's entries were not a daily record, but rather poetic observations, sketches, and philosophical musings. She wrote about the solitude of the lighthouse, her love for the ocean, and her quiet yearning for something more. But in the last few pages, the tone shifted. October 10th, 1968. The humming grows louder. It calls from the rocks, a low, deep thrum beneath the waves. Not the wind, not the tide. Something else. I feel drawn to it, a melody only I can hear. October 15th, 1968. I saw it today, in the mist at the mouth of the cove. A fleeting shape. Not a boat, not a creature of the sea. It shimmered, just for a moment, like light bending. Am I dreaming? Or is the doorway real? October 16th, 1968. The hum. The shape. It wants me. I feel it. It is gentle but insistent. I must understand. Tomorrow, I will go closer. I will find the source of the song. The final entry, dated October 17th, 1968, was brief, almost a fragment. The mist rose early. The hum is like a heartbeat now. I am going to the cove. The door is open. And then, just a small, delicate sketch of a spiral, like a seashell or a distant galaxy. The journal ended there. No further entries. No explanation. Just the echo of a young girl's wonder, curiosity, and perhaps, her fateful journey into the unknown. I sat there, the journal resting in my hands, the soft lamplight casting long shadows across the page. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof, a gentle percussion to my thoughts. Alara Vance hadn't merely disappeared. She had walked towards a mystery she felt beckoned her, a secret within the very landscape of Oakhaven. What was the humming? What shape did she see? Was it a natural phenomenon she misinterpreted, or something far more unusual? Was it a person, a boat, a hallucination, or something truly inexplicable, a part of Oakhaven's deeper, untamed nature? The fading daughter legend, the singing stones, the doorway in the mist. They all intertwined with Alara's last words, creating a tapestry of folklore and unsettling reality. I concluded my research in Oakhaven, packing my notes and Alara's copied journal entries with a quiet reverence. I left the small cottage, the scent of salt and pine clinging to my clothes, but the mystery of Alara Vance remained with me. The official file in the Historical Society remained thin, incomplete. Her case was still unresolved, and likely always would be. Sometimes, as I sit in my study, the city sounds a distant hum outside my window. I think of Alara. I picture her, a young girl with an artist's eye and a dreamer's soul, walking towards the misty cove, drawn by a melody only she could hear. I imagine the soft, insistent hum, the shimmering shape, the open door. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, among the vast, indifferent currents of the ocean or hidden within the ancient mists of Oakhaven, Alara Vance found the answers she sought. The wind outside whispers, and the rain taps gently on the glass, a soft, soothing reminder that some stories, even true ones, are meant to remain just a little bit unsolved, lingering like a secret whispered in the quiet of the night. Story 5. It was during one of those interminable late autumn nights, the kind where the world outside seemed to shrink to the immediate circle of the lamplight, that I first stumbled upon the quiet enigma of Oakhaven. The rain had been falling for days, a relentless, gentle drumming on the old Victorian's roof that was both soothing and insistent, urging me deeper into the house's quiet embrace. I was in Oakhaven for a different purpose entirely, you see, researching the forgotten trade routes of the coastal lumber industry, for a small historical society grant. But as often happens with old towns, especially those that cling to the edges of ancient forests, Oakhaven held secrets, like dust motes dancing in sunbeams, only visible when you looked just right. The house I'd rented for my research, perched on a slight rise overlooking the main street, was an old spinster of a place, full of creaks and whispers. Its walls seemed to breathe with the accumulated stories of generations. Each evening, as dusk bled into the deepest indigo of night, I'd make myself a pot of chamomile tea, the steam curling like a gentle sigh from the mug, and settle into the overstuffed armchair by the tall, narrow window. My companion was usually a stack of brittle, yellowed newspapers from the town's defunct gazette, the Oakhaven Echo, or ledgers filled with neat, looping script detailing everything from timber sales to general store inventories. It was in a bound volume of the Echo, dated from the early 1930s, that I first saw it. A brief, almost dismissive paragraph, tucked between an advertisement for patent medicine and a report on the local bake sale. It spoke of the continued absence of Elias Thorne, the reclusive woodcarver of the Whispering Pines, whose whereabouts remain unknown. It was so short, so understated, that I almost missed it. Just a few lines. But there was something in its very brevity, its quiet acknowledgement of a person simply gone, that snagged my attention. Like a snagged thread on an old sweater, it pulled at something. I made a mental note, a tiny ripple in the placid pond of my primary research. Elias Thorne, Whispering Pines. The name of the forest had always intrigued me. It wasn't merely descriptive. The local lore held that the pines actually whispered, a low, constant murmur that shifted with the wind, sometimes sounding like distant voices, sometimes like a mournful sigh. It was a place the townsfolk respected, a place of beauty but also of unspoken boundaries. Over the next few evenings, as the rain continued its lullaby against the windows, I began to actively seek out more mentions of Elias Thorne. It was like sifting through sand for grains of gold. The Echo was sparse on details. A follow-up piece, a month later, reiterated his absence, noting the mystery surrounding his disappearance, but offering no new leads. The police, the article stated, had concluded their efforts, finding no signs of foul play, no struggle, just an empty cabin and a quiet forest. No signs of foul play. That phrase echoed in the quiet house. It meant no violence, no struggle, no clear indication of a malicious act. It meant a vanishing, pure and simple. And that, to me, was far more intriguing. Violence often leaves loud, undeniable scars. A vanishing, however, leaves a profound silence, a blank space that invited the mind to wander. My lumber research began to take a back seat. The scent of old paper and dust, usually associated with long-dead trees and forgotten invoices, now carried the faint, almost imperceptible scent of an untold story. I found maps of Oakhaven from that era, marking the dense expanse of the Whispering Pines, and somewhere within it, a tiny, hand-drawn X labeled Thorne's cabin. It was deep, deep within the woods, far from any established road. Elias Thorne truly was a recluse. The few official records I found on Elias Thorne offered little. Born in Oakhaven, lived there his entire life. Never married, no immediate family. A quiet man, known for his extraordinary wood carvings. Animals mostly. Birds with such lifelike feathers you almost expected them to take flight, deer poised mid-stride, their eyes seeming to hold a deep, knowing wisdom. The few surviving pieces I learned from a small pamphlet at the local history museum, a single room in the old town hall, were now scattered in private collections. They spoke of his skill, but offered no insight into the man himself. As the days turned into weeks, and the rain softened to a persistent drizzle, I ventured out, often with my old canvas map, seeking out the oldest residents of Oakhaven. It wasn't easy. Old towns, especially those with quiet histories, tend to guard their secrets. But a patient ear, a respectful demeanor, and a genuine interest often unlocked doors. Mrs. Gable, a spry woman of 92 who ran the local antique shop, really more of a dusty repository of Oakhaven's past, was my first real break. She remembered Elias Thorne. "Oh, Elias," she'd said, her voice a reedy whisper, her eyes distant, fixed on some unseen point in the cluttered shop. He was different. Always sketching, always carving. His hands, they were magic, you know. Could make wood sing. I asked her about his disappearance. She paused, her gaze settling on a tarnished silver locket on a display stand. Never understood it. Just gone, like the wood swallowed him whole. She then lowered her voice, almost conspiratorially. Some folks said the pines finally claimed him. said he spent too much time listening to their whispers. It was the first mention of the whispers in a conversational context, not just as a name on a map. I pressed gently. The whispers? Mrs. Gable smiled, a frail, knowing smile. Oh dear, you must be new to Oakhaven. The pines, they have a way about them. Sounds like voices sometimes, when the wind is just right. Some say it's the old spirits, guiding lost travelers. Others, she paused, her eyes glinting. Others say it's the pines themselves, calling to those who listen too closely. Her words didn't alarm me, they intrigued me. It was folklore, of course, but even folklore held a kernel of truth, often reflecting the deepest anxieties or wonders of a community. Elias Thorne, a solitary man, immersed in the natural world, living on the edge of a forest renowned for its mysterious whispers, it painted a picture, albeit an impressionistic one. My next stop was the town library, a small, welcoming place, smelling of aged paper and lemon polish. The librarian, a kindly woman named Eleanor, had been in Oakhaven her entire life. She remembered whispers about Elias Thorne, too, but mostly the sadness associated with his vanishing. Poor man, she'd sighed, adjusting her spectacles. He was a gentle soul, never bothered anyone. It was just so unlike him to leave without a trace. I asked her if anyone ever found anything after he disappeared. She shook her head. Nothing. No note, no sign. His cabin was just empty, as if he'd stepped out for a moment and never returned. She looked at me, a touch of melancholy in her eyes. It was before my time, truly, but my grandmother, she used to say that sometimes the forest just decides it needs a keeper. And Elias, well, he was certainly devoted to it. The idea of the forest claiming, or needing a keeper, was another layer of this quiet, unsettling narrative. It wasn't a crime in the violent sense, but a surrender, perhaps, to something vast and ancient. One sunny, crisp morning, after the rain had finally given way to a brilliant, almost defiant blue sky, I decided to venture into the whispering pines. The path to Thorne's cabin, according to my old map, was little more than a game trail, almost swallowed by undergrowth. The air was cool and damp, carrying the rich, earthy scent of pine needles and wet soil. Sunlight dappled through the high canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. As I walked deeper, the sounds of the town faded. The rustle of leaves underfoot, the occasional chirp of a bird, and then, faintly at first, the wind began its work. A low, sustained sighing, like 1,000 distant voices murmuring secrets. It wasn't unsettling in an aggressive way, but rather in its sheer omnipresence. It was a sound that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the trees themselves. It took me nearly 2 hours to find the cabin. It was small, built of rough-hewn timber, now leaning precariously, almost swallowed by ivy and moss. The windows were empty sockets, the door ajar, hanging crookedly on one rusted hinge. It felt less like a place abandoned, and more like a place paused, as if its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment. Inside, the cabin was barren. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom. A crude workbench still stood against one wall, littered with ancient wood shavings, brittle and dark. A few carving tools, rusted but still recognizable, lay scattered as if dropped in haste. And then there it was on the workbench, bathed in a narrow shaft of sunlight. An unfinished carving. It wasn't one of Elias Thorne's usual animals. This was different. It was the rough form of a figure, half human, half something else, its features only vaguely defined. But what was there suggested a creature of the forest, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and something akin to sorrow. Its limbs seemed to flow into the wood, becoming part of the grain. It was deeply unsettling, not because it was grotesque, but because it felt desperate, as if Elias was trying to capture something just beyond his reach, something that defied the limits of wood and human understanding. I spent a long time there, just looking at the carving, feeling the profound stillness of the cabin. The whispers of the pines outside seemed to grow louder, as if observing me. There was no closure, no dramatic discovery. Just that unfinished carving, a silent testament to Elias Thorne's last known artistic endeavor, and perhaps his last conscious thought. As the afternoon light began to wane, painting the forest in long, golden streaks, I carefully made my way back, the image of that carving etched into my mind. The path back seemed to flow differently, perhaps because my perception had shifted. The whispers in the trees no longer seemed just wind. They seemed to carry something more. Back in the warmth of my rented house, the rain had returned, a gentle curtain against the window panes. I made myself another cup of tea, the aroma of chamomile a comforting presence. The Elias Thorne story, the vanishing of the woodcarver, was not a case for a detective. There were no suspects, no motives in the conventional sense, no clear victim beyond the simple fact of his absence. It was a story that transcended typical crime, becoming something far more ethereal. I never found the full truth of Elias Thorne's disappearance, nor did I expect to. There was no missing piece of evidence waiting to be unearthed, no confession hidden in a forgotten letter. The story of Elias Thorne wasn't about what happened to him, but perhaps what he became or what he sought. Sometimes, late at night, as the rain patters softly against the roof and the lamplight casts long, dancing shadows on the walls, I think of Elias Thorne and his unfinished carving. I think of the whispering pines and their ancient, murmuring voices. And I wonder if, out there in that vast, quiet forest, Elias Thorne found the ultimate subject for his art, a communion so profound that it rendered him simply part of the wood, part of the whispers, forever entwined with the silent mysteries of Oakhaven. Story 6. In the quiet embrace of Oakhaven, where the land met the restless churn of the Pacific, nights often arrived cloaked in a soft, persistent drizzle. It's on such nights, when the rain patters a gentle rhythm against the old window panes of my study, that my thoughts drift to the stories woven into the very fabric of this town. I am Arthur Penhaligon, a historian by trade, though in my retirement, I've become something of a keeper of Oakhaven's forgotten whispers. My days are spent sifting through brittle newspaper clippings, dusty ledgers, and the occasional faded photograph, each a tiny fragment of a past that lingers just beneath the surface of the present. The scent of old paper and the subtle aroma of brewing Earl Grey tea usually fill this room, a comforting refuge from the world outside. My lamp casts a warm, buttery glow, illuminating the pages of whatever tome has captured my attention. But for the past few months, my focus has been less on grand historical movements and more on the quiet, unresolved echoes of a single, perplexing event. It's a story not of heroic deeds or momentous changes, but of a quiet disappearance, a life that simply unspooled itself from the town's narrative, leaving behind only a curious void. It began quite by accident, as many such journeys do. I was tracing the lineage of Oakhaven's oldest fishing families for a local historical society project, a pleasant enough diversion. In a box marked Miscellaneous 1950s, tucked beneath an assortment of faded invoices and a curious hand-drawn map of proposed oyster beds, I found it. A small, unadorned leather-bound journal. Its pages were delicate, the ink faint in places, but the looping cursive was undeniably elegant. It wasn't a diary, not in the traditional sense, but more a collection of observations, sketches, and philosophical musings. And within its quiet entries, I stumbled upon the name that would gradually, gently, pull me into the currents of an old mystery, Elara Vance. Elara Vance, as I would soon discover through diligent cross-referencing and the help of a few very aged townspeople, had arrived in Oakhaven in the spring of 1957. She was, by all accounts, an enigma. Not unkind, certainly not overtly rebellious, but simply different. She wasn't from Oakhaven, a fact that in itself marked her. Her origins were vaguely referred to as from the East, a catch-all term for anywhere beyond the Cascades. She rented a small, weather-beaten cottage on the very edge of town, perched precariously above the rocky coastline, exposed to the full brunt of the ocean's moods. She was an artist, they said, though few in Oakhaven truly understood her art. She painted the sea, yes, but not in the conventional, picturesque way. Her canvases, even in the few blurry photographs I found, seemed to capture the raw, untamed spirit of the deep, the shifting lights beneath the waves, and sometimes shapes that hinted at something more primordial than fish or rock. The journal, which turned out to be hers, contained no dramatic revelations, no frantic pleas for help. Instead, it offered glimpses into her singular perspective. She wrote of the hum of the deep, of the voices carried on the mist, and of a peculiar fascination with the old, abandoned lighthouse on the farthest, most treacherous point of the bay. The light, she wrote in one entry, dated late October 1958, calls to me. Not the beam, but the silence between its flashes. It holds a secret, I feel it, a knowledge of what truly dwells in the dark. Such entries, when read in isolation, might seem merely poetic, the musings of a sensitive artist. But when viewed through the lens of what came next, they took on a peculiar, unsettling resonance. The event itself occurred in early November 1958. A storm, even by Oakhaven standards, had raged for 3 days. The kind of tempest that made the old houses creak like ships at sea, that sent waves crashing against the cliffs with a thunderous roar. On the fourth morning, when the winds had finally subsided to a mournful howl and the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, a neighbor, concerned by the lack of activity at Alara's cottage, went to check on her. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. Her easel stood in the corner with a half-finished painting of a tempestuous sea. Her teacup sat on the small table by the window. A book lay open face down on the bed. But Alara Vance was gone. There was, of course, an investigation. The local sheriff, a kindly but practical man named Thomas Tom Miller, who was then quite young, conducted a thorough search. The coastline was scoured, the rocky coves explored, but nothing was found. No note, no sign of struggle, no trace of her whereabouts. The prevailing theory, quietly whispered and eventually accepted, was that Alara, being the unconventional soul she was, had simply decided to leave Oakhaven. Perhaps the wildness of the place had finally become too much, or perhaps she had found a new muse elsewhere. The storm provided a convenient cover. In such conditions, anything was possible, even a quiet, unobserved departure. Her few belongings were packed away by the sheriff and sent to an address provided by a distant relative, a cousin in Ohio who seemed just as bewildered by Alara's life as Oakhaven had been. The file was eventually closed, the case marked voluntary disappearance, and Alara Vance became another forgotten whisper in the town's long history. But as I read her journal, poring over its delicate pages under the soft lamplight, a sense of disquiet began to stir within me. Her words, so imbued with a deep connection to Oakhaven's wild beauty, didn't quite align with the idea of a sudden, unannounced departure. "The sea here," she wrote, "is a part of my soul. I could not imagine life without its constant conversation." There was a yearning, a sense of belonging in her entries, that seemed to contradict the notion of simply walking away. I found myself returning to the old newspaper clippings, scanning the archives of the Oakhaven Chronicle for any mention of the storm or Alara's disappearance. The initial reports were brief, factual, confirming what Sheriff Miller had concluded. But then, tucked away in the back pages of an issue from late November 1958, I found a small, almost unnoticeable piece. A letter to the editor, written by a fisherman named Silas Croft, a man known for his solitary nature and keen eye for the sea. Silas, in his curt, almost dismissive prose, questioned the sheriff's conclusion. He spoke of strange lights seen during the height of the storm, not lightning, not the lighthouse beam, but something moving with purpose far out on the water, near the Devil's Teeth, a cluster of particularly treacherous sea stacks. He claimed they were too bright, too steady, to be a fishing vessel caught in the tempest. His letter was dismissed by the editor with a brief, almost apologetic note about the stresses of a severe storm affecting perceptions. But Alara's journal, her fascination with the hum of the deep and the silence between the flashes of the lighthouse, made Silas's observation resonate with a new, subtle chill. I decided to seek out anyone who might still remember Alara Vance, or the storm of '58. My search led me to Agnes Periwinkle, a spry woman in her late 90s who ran the town's general store for decades. Her memory, though occasionally meandering, was remarkably sharp and coaxed gently. Agnes remembered Alara. "A peculiar one," she'd said, her voice a reedy whisper, "but a kind heart. Always bought her paints and a specific brand of dark tea. And always looked out at the sea, like she was waiting for something." I asked about the storm, about the lights Silas Croft had mentioned. Agnes paused, her eyes, clouded with age, seemed to look beyond me, towards some distant horizon. "The storm was a beast," she finally murmured. "And yes, there was talk. Whispers. Not about ships, mind you, but about something different. The old ones, they spoke of the sea reaching out, claiming its own." She offered no further explanation, just a faraway look that spoke volumes of unspoken beliefs. It was the kind of local folklore that usually faded with time, dismissed as superstition, but in the context of Alara's disappearance, it added another layer to the enigma. My research deepened. I found a faded photograph in the local library's small collection, a blurry image of the Oakhaven Art Guild's annual exhibition from 1958. In the background, partially obscured, was one of Alara's paintings. It depicted a series of swirling, almost hypnotic patterns in deep blues and greens, with faint, glowing orbs seemingly rising from the depths. It was unlike anything else in the photograph, strikingly modern and almost ethereal for its time. It was the hum of the deep rendered in paint, the voices carried on the mist, given visual form. Could her art have been more than just imagination? Could it have been an attempt to capture something real, something unseen by others? I also managed to track down a distant relative of Silas Croft, his grandniece, who still lived in a small, isolated cabin along the coast. She remembered her great-uncle as a man of few words, but profound conviction. Silas, she'd told me, her voice raspy from years of sea air. He saw things others didn't. He spent his life on that water. He knew its moods, its secrets. If he said he saw something strange, he saw something strange. He wasn't one for fanciful tales. She showed me an old, weather-beaten telescope mounted on a stand that had belonged to Silas. He used to spend hours just watching the horizon, she recalled, especially on rough nights. Said the ocean showed its true face then. The idea of Silas, steadfastly observing the stormy night through his telescope, lending weight to his claim of unusual lights, chipped away further at the official narrative of a simple, voluntary disappearance. The more I delved, the more the simplicity of the she ran away theory began to crumble, replaced by a growing mosaic of tantalizing, yet frustratingly incomplete details. The artistic sensibility of Alara, her deep connection to the sea, the subtle mentions in her journal, Silas Croft's unwavering account of unusual lights during the storm, and the old whispers of the sea claiming its own. Each piece, individually, was perhaps insignificant, but together they painted a picture of something far more complex, far more mysterious, than a woman simply deciding to pack her bags and leave. I often find myself walking the path to Alara's old cottage now, especially when the evening mist rolls in, shrouding the coastline in a soft, gray veil. The cottage is abandoned, its windows dark, its timbers weathered by decades of salt and wind. Yet, in the quiet, when the only sounds are the distant cry of gulls and the rhythmic surge of the tide, I feel her presence there. Not a ghostly presence, but an echo of a curious mind, a sensitive soul, and a profound connection to the elemental forces that surrounded her. The truth of what happened to Alara Vance that stormy November night in 1958 remains elusive. There are no grand revelations, no smoking guns, no definitive answers. The official record stands as it is. Yet, the whispers of Oakhaven tell a different story. They speak of a woman who didn't simply leave, but perhaps was drawn into something greater, something beyond human comprehension, something that the wild, ancient sea holds in its silent depths. Was it the strange lights Silas saw? Was it the hum of the deep Alara sensed? Or was it simply the vast, indifferent maw of the ocean, swallowing a life whole, leaving only questions in its wake? The rain outside my window has softened to a mere sigh, a gentle lullaby. The tea has grown cool, and the lamp still casts its warm glow. Alara Vance's journal lies open on my desk, its pages filled with her delicate script, her dreams, and her quiet observations of a world she perceived so differently. And as I close my eyes, listening to the ceaseless murmur of the Pacific, I can almost hear the soft, persistent whispers of Oakhaven, carrying the unsolved story of Alara Vance on the evening breeze. A true crime that lingers not in sensational headlines, but in the quiet, reflective depths of memory. It's a tale of absence, of what happens when a life becomes a question, carried away by the tides, never truly returning to shore.